spoken before me and those who will present after me. So I guess climate change is something that you have heard over and over again. Maybe not many of you are dealing or have heard about the assisted migration. So I would assume that you probably have, but not to the extent that not to the direction that I would like to take in my presentation. And because of that, I just have to start by reminding you that whatever you do with the forest, whether you harvest the forest, you plant the forest, you tend it in a way, you have always to realize that, to remember that it starts by the seed. You plant the seed, and then everything proceeds from there. So any attempt to adapt the forest to climate change has to start with the material we choose to put on the land. So I'll give you some brief explanation or description of the concept of evolution and adaptation of plants to the environment. Then I'll touch about the general concept of assisted migration and how it is applied or what it means in forestry. Then I'll talk a little bit about the research that we have been doing at a better environment and sustainable resource development for some times as a way of illustrating to you how the plants and the environment are related, and that if we want to manage the consequences of environmental change, we have to manage it from the genetic concept, the genetic concept or genetic manipulation of the planting material themselves. And then I'll flip back a bit back to assisted migration in forestry in the context of climate change and tell you what we have been doing as a government here. Now, to begin with, Fyodor Dobzhansky, this is an American evolution biologist of Russian origin, of course. In 1964, he wrote that there's nothing that makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution. And I think about it. In biology, there is nothing, including applied biology like forestry, there's nothing that makes sense except if you translate it from the evolutionary point of view. And this is easy to understand if you consider that most of the morphological, physiological, or other characteristics that a living organism has is a result of an evolutionary process. Where you live, the location where the plants live, the animal live, we humans, if we don't want to live in a place that is cold or is hot, is dry, or is noisy, you just leave, just migrate into other places. But unfortunately, plants don't move. Some other animals don't move that much, so they have to withstand those environments. And in order to do that, they have to undergo an evolutionary process that gives them some characteristics that are suitable to tolerate the conditions of the environment. And that's what basically do. And how do they do that? Evolution is just basically a cyclic process of events that are familiar. You start with a mutation, with just a change at the genetics level within the organism itself for an individual. Then a characteristic that arises as a result of change, it recombined through sex, of course, sexual reproduction. You just mother and father recombine that characteristic into a child, and you produce another organism or another offspring that has particular characteristics that the parents may not have, or just an average of the parents. And a bearer of that new characteristic undergo a process of natural selection that you have heard from Darwin. And those ones who possess that characteristic at a better advantage, they multiply in number and they dominate the population. while those who inherit a bad copy of that genes, they get eliminated. And through migration, migration means you move, you intermarry in the other population, you move and live in some other places, but you matter only if you marry in that population and they have children, and the children propagate themselves over and over and over through generation. And if, for some reason, a population boxes itself within its own area, marry within all the time, doesn't mix up with the outside world, it's just end up in marrying within the kins, the relatives. And then you localize certain behavior, you start getting some genetic diseases and some other things. So the plants actually follow the same mechanism, the same process that we humans think of. Now, what's natural selection? Natural selection is a strong evolutionary process that really translates directly to what we're doing in forest and agricultural system. It's basically natural selection by the environment, where conditions of the environment, say climate, acts on the characteristic of the organisms to sort out those which are fit and those which are not. And by the fittest, which you have heard, of course, from Darwin, by the fittest means those who reproduce more and survive more. And reproduce more means having more children who can survive and have more children of their own, so that it becomes more of a continuous process. And in plants, for example, we may think of an evolutionary selection pressure as a physical environment, like a climate, when we are interested in, say, talking about the adaptation of the plant to the environment, temperature, to water, moisture, stress, and these others. Or we can think also the evolutionary process, natural selection pressure as a biological organism, for example, a disease or an insect, like mountain pine beetle, which is acting on pine. So in the end, after an extended period of living in that stressful environment, you end up evolving mechanism where you can tolerate those kind of environments. So my talk today will not touch about the insects and disease, which Mike has done. I'll concentrate on the physical environment, especially climate, as a natural selection pressure. So what is assisted migration? Assisted migration, as a concept, originated from the conservation biologist, and it really means the deliberate introduction of a species outside its natural range. For example, we know what the natural range of white spruce is in Canada and in the Lake States in the US. So if I were to introduce white spruce outside that area, in a place where there is no white spruce, then it's become assisted migration. That's basically what the original concept was. And if you look at it this way, the concept itself is meant to protect the species from extinction or from extirpation, and extirpation means the disappearance of a species from a certain localities. If you look at it this way, as an introduction of the species outside its range, then it's become a controversial issue in the sense that it implies assisted colonization. And when you talk about assisted colonization, then you are bringing in the fear of environmental consequences, such as invasive species. The species itself may colonize more environment of the local species, or it may come with it some pests and insects and diseases that were not native in those areas. And those ones may end up in adapting to the species that are native to that area, and then you end up having some kind of consequences that you didn't intend. But as usual in forestry and some agricultural system, we always find a way of adapting yourself to new concepts and giving them some meaning in a more or less destructive way. For example, in forest, I'll show you what we mean by assisted migration. So assisted migration in the current use of forestry is basically not moving species outside its natural range, but moving the population within the range to meet a certain particular objective. And this is to manage the positive or negative consequences of climate change. Negative consequences of climate change is where, for example, the climate change makes it difficult for trees to survive, remain healthy, and remain productive. While positive ones is where climate change creates an environment of a more productive forest than we currently have. For example, if an area is very cold now but have enough moisture, warming obviously would be an advantage in the sense that it makes heat available to use the moisture that is in there not being used in order to have a more productive forest. So therefore, in forestry, assisted migration really has something to do with ensuring the successful regeneration of the forests, maintaining or increasing productivity, and in productivity, most of you are foresters, so productivity probably refers to fiber production, and conserving the species' genetic diversity. Now, why do we need to assist the species to migrate or populations to migrate? So, to understand this, you have to remember that there is a very strong link between the genetic variation of forest trees and other plants to variation in the climate. Whenever you have a variable climate in the area, you will always have a genetically variable species because each environment set up its degree of environmental stress where some population have to live in there, that are only tolerant to that kind of environment. Therefore, natural selection, as a reminder, is just a differential survival and differential productivity of population. And evolution is through this mechanism in trees, because trees are very long-lived organisms. One generation of trees, when you plant a seed, like spruce, probably take 25 years before you can get seed from it. And another generation, another 25 years before you can get another generation of seed from a new forest. So you're talking about a very long lifespan of the production cycle, while climate change that is predicted is happening within a couple of decades. So then the rate of evolution of plants is much slower than the rate of change of human-induced climate change. So that's basically why we need assisted migration. Now in forestry, we have a very long history of experimenting with trees. And the reason we are always interested in establishing some kind of a pattern of genetic variation in the species, relating that to physical variation in nature in terms of climate, and then using that as a criteria for setting up standards or regulation in which that governs how we move the reproductive material. Reproductive material, it means seed and clones, depending on the species we're talking about. This experiment can be in the field, or can be in the greenhouse in growth chambers. There are new biochemical and molecular biology techniques that are available now, and we use this relationship that we discover to manage the genetics of planted forest. Now, I'll take you quickly through one of the experiments that we have to show you, and I just want you to take one message from here, and take a home message here. Here, I'm just trying to show you the linkage between the characteristics of the trees and the characteristics of the environment from the evolutionary point of view, and then translate that into forest management. Here, on the left, here you have white spruce. This is the natural range of white spruce in Alberta. So these dots is where we have sampled the populations, very good representation of the species in the province. And on this map is where we have planted this population. Here on the north, here is the north of high level. Here is closed Manning. Here is Fort McMurray, Grand Prairie, Slave Lake, Lackabish, then close to Edson, and then Prairie Creek, that is south of Rocky Mountain House. You can see the differences in climate between those test locations. On the north, you have high level at around 59 degrees of latitude, then all the way south. And all those populations that you have seen in the map are planted at all that site, at all these sites. The intention here is for us to see actually which grows better there on each of those sites. And you can see how climatically variable these populations are. I don't want to go through this table, but I think you can understand it. You can see how cold it is if you consider the cumulative negative degree days, NDD. It is 28, 44, minus 29, 24 in the north, and then all the way to 13 something, 48 in the south. And you can also look at the temperature extreme, MCM and minimum. Those are basically average January temperatures. And I hope you can understand the rest of the table. If you look at this table, this basically I've taken a simple correlation between the climate data and the location in terms of latitude, elevation, and the longitude. You can see in the second column, when you're talking about the north-south movement in Alberta, basically you're talking about the change in winter temperatures. Become colder as you go on the north and the warmer as you go south. And also elevation. Warmer at lower elevation, colder as the high in the mountains. And when you talk about east-west, that is just a time zone. There is no climatic relationship in there. You can see the very small correlation on column 3. And the P1 and P2 in there, these are the climate index that I've created through statistics by just condensing 11 climate variables into climate axis or index through the principal component analysis. This is statistics. And I will use that one to illustrate the points that I'm trying to get you to appreciate. Now, this experiment obviously starts as seed and seedlings in the greenhouse. So you see a nice greenhouse in seedlings of pine in there. So we understand where each of that seedling come from in terms of their sources from the province. Then we put them as experiment in the field. Here is a diamond here close to Rocky Mountain House. We have about more than 15 experiments in here of different species, including even foreign species from Europe and some trees population from the United States. This is in, I think, Dry Creek in the Rocky Mountains. This is Smoky Lake, and this is Clearwater also in the Rocky Mountains. So we monitor the growth of those trees for many years. So this one is the spruce that I've shown you, and this is the measurement that we made when these trees were 27 years old. So they are pretty much old. They have been in the field for some time. Now, here, I just put a regression. On the x-axis is the climate index that shows the severity of winter from one location to another. The -7 on the left, on this, on this side here is the northernmost area that we have, that is north of high level, and on this one, on this side is Rocky Mountains, on the Rocky Mountain side in the south, and here in the middle, obviously, is the center, in the middle of the province. Now, what I want you to see is which populations grow better at each of those sites. So I'll move you a little bit slowly south. You can see here in high level, where according to that climate index is -2.47, which is basically at this corner here, where you have the highest growth. So if I want to plant trees in high level, I have to use the population, the city from high level, not from Rocky Mountain House, not from Fort McMurray, because the growth that you have, the best growth that you have is from there. On the left, on the right, you have Manning in here. You can see, if I want to get the productive forest in Manning, I have to use the seed from around Manning itself. you will see now the population in high level, which were better in high level site, they have dropped on this side now. And this one are from the Rocky Mountain area. Now, if you go further south in Fort McMurray, the same. Fort McMurray here is around minus 1.5. So you'll see the best growth has to come from that area. You have to use the seed from that area. The same way, when you come further down in Rakabish, it's around 1.27. So the peak of this curve is around that area. If you come further south in Exton, the same trend. If you want to grow a productive forest in Edson, you have to use seed from close to Edson. So, in a way, you see the same trend repeating. And this is why we always control what you plant on the tree, on the land, because we don't want to lose productivity just because of planting anything that we can lend our hands on. There is a clear relationship between the environment and the genetics of the trees that grow in that area. And here is a different diagram, but plotted using the north-south, the location descriptors, which is the latitude. You can see they are just the same plots like those I showed you with the climate, but here I plotted them with the latitude. And this makes life very easier for us and for you, because instead of talking to you or saying that if you want to plant trees in Calling Lake, just get seed from, say, mean annual temperature of 0.3, you don't know geographically where that is. But if I say use seed from, say, latitude 54.8, at least you can locate that with the GPS or something else. Okay? So this is basically the same. You can use also elevation descriptors because these ones are surrogate variables for the climate. Here, I did a cluster analysis using all the measurements that we have had, because these trees have been measured since when they were age 10, measured at every 3 years until they were almost 30 years. So here, I'm trying to use a cluster analysis to try to grow all the populations and try to see if there is a trend that you can discern in this data, and they use that one as an information that you can use to formulate seed transfer standard. On the left, this is the cluster analysis produced through growth variables, height and diameter at breast height, and this one is produced through using the data that are extracted from those regression I have shown you, but by establishing an optimum point where this regression perform well. On the left, it looks like kind of a fuzzy diagram, complicated, but it's not complicated. What you can see here, there are major 3 groups. There is this lower one group, and this one on top. This one and this one are made up of slow-growing populations. These slow-growing populations are from high latitude in the northern part of the province, and those in the mountains, in the Rocky Mountain, in the southwest. They grow very slowly. And the reason they grow very slowly is because the environment in those areas is so harsh that if you are faced with the risk of dying and the advantage of growing in large sites, what do you choose? You first choose to save your life by just allocating a lot of your energy towards those processes that makes you survive in a harsh environment before you can reserve something to grow bigger. Okay? Now, this large middle branch in the province, it has variability within it, of course, but it represents all the populations from the central part of the province. These are the middle altitude areas and the middle elevation areas. So this one, at least by Alberta standards, they are mild climate. development, and that's where the most productive populations come from. On the left, on the right, is a cluster analysis based on optimum climate of the population. But if you look at it carefully, without just make it a little bit complicated here, it gives you more or less the same information that you get, same trend that you get from the left diagram. Oh, sorry, let's miss it. So, next, here is a different technique that I've used to try to discern the relationship between the planting sites and the population. Now, just make it simple. You see in this area, this quadrant in here on the left, your left, is made up of the population from the north, of the northern part of the province, and the planting site of northern part of the province. So you see a clear association here between the northern populations and the northern testing site. On this lower side in here is a group that includes the population from the south of the province in the mountains and the test sites that are in that area, because that's where you have Rocky Mountain House, you have Edison, and and on the upper left corner, that's where you have high-level mining, Fort McMurray. And in the middle here is that where you have all the sites and the population from the middle part of the province. So it's still the same trend. Oh. Okay, so where do we use that information? And I think some of you are familiar with the seed zones. So when we use this system of seed zone, what we are just doing basically, we're just trying to manage this adaptation of populations to the environment. And the rules is that if you operate within the seed zone system, you will be safer, because the seed zone is basically based on the climatic similarity between the areas that where we think is uniform enough for practical purposes, not completely uniform, but at least it is uniform for practical reforestation purposes. And the information that I've shown you through our research is just basically supplement this kind of a system. And if you were to deviate from it, at least we will reference back to the data we have to see if the deviation you're asking is actually supported. Is it harmful to the environment? Is it harmful to the productivity of Alberta's forests, etc.? So now, what I showed you was on spruce, but we have similar work for pines, lodgepole pine, jack pine, for tamarack, for Douglas fir, and I think we can expect the same kind of a trend for species that we haven't tested, like the shrubs. So what does that mean? It means the most limiting characteristic of the environment is normally the characteristic that basically dictate how evolution takes place. Something that is in short supply, something that stress the plant, is that same climatic variable that dictates how evolution of these plants will take place. And that's why when we regulate the movement of seed, we are always referencing using the most limiting factor of the environment as a guide or as the reference point. And in the current climate, if there were no climate change, what we would reference is winter temperatures as our guide in order to prevent the frost damage, for example, to make sure that trees have sufficient heat to grow, to make sure that trees have sufficient conditions to flower and continue production. Now, climate is one of the pieces that dictate how evolution in plant takes place. Plants are still, by and large, trees are, by and large, are still wildly material. So they still respond to other forces of nature, especially the day length or photoperiod. So trees do have that kind of circadian rhythms, dictating, tracking the change of a day and night throughout the year. Agricultural crops have undergone thousands of years of breeding by native people. And one of the things that they did, they just stripped those plants their photoperiod sensitivity. That's why you can have now corn from Mexico and the southern US growing everywhere in the world, because they're no longer able to track that changes in day and night. That's why you can have vegetables from China and far other countries in the Far East growing in Edmonton comfortably, because they no longer track that natural rhythm of a changing day and night throughout the year. So what is the rules now that we have in Alberta operating through the seed zone? It's just very simple. That if you're using the wild seed that you have collected from a wild stand, just collect from a seed zone and plant within that seed zone. And the reason here is just to maintain adaptation. And we also use these seed zones as units for genetic conservation to keep representative population of the original material, even if you do artificial deforestation. Now, if you want permission to plant trees outside the seed zone, you always have to fill a form and provide some basic information of which type of seed you want to use. And then we look into our research and see if that is harmful or is something that we can tolerate. So you either get denied or you get permission to use. But we also consider some other things. There is an issue of hybridization, for example, between lodge pine and jack pine, or Engelmann spruce and white spruce. These hybridization happen in nature, but depending on how we do reforestation, you can enhance these things. So we look at this one to make sure that we don't do that, and also the potential for increasing pests and diseases. Okay, so now, again, back to assisted migration. So in these regressions that I've showed here I have regressed each population by itself. I'm not comparing it with anything else. Each of these lines is a regression of the population height growth over many sites. On this side is high level, from high level all the way to the south. And sorry for that, the second diagram here has a wrong axis, wrong axis labeled wrong. This one here. Oh, sorry. This is the P2. What I want to illustrate here, if I plant the same population in high level in the Grand Prairie, it grows 26% more in Grand Prairie than in high level in terms of height, and 49% more in diameter compared to high level. The same way, if I plant the same population at 20 meters elevation in the mountain, is to grow 28% less than the way it grows with Grand Prairie. So you can equate that on climate change, that if the climate of one place, say high level, if Grand Prairie was to have the same climate as high level, you would lose 26% of your growth at high level, I mean at Grand Prairie, by simply planting trees from high level there. If I made myself clear, time is running out. So in terms of assisted migration, you have to look the province at three major regions in a way. You have the northern part of Alberta, which is cool and dry and very continental. I'll just call it Region 1 for now. You have the Rocky Mountain and foothill areas, upper foothill area, which is cold. It's cool, not very cold because of the Pacific influence, but it's moist, so it lacks heat. And the southern boreal area, which encompasses much of the productive forest now, which is warm and dry, warm and moist. So in those groups, what the problem would be? In the central part of the province where our forest productivity is high, that is an area which is predicted to be dry. Rich area has shown you that is where you expect a drought, and therefore you are going to have less productive forest than you currently have. In the mountains, there is enough precipitation, as Rick Schneider has shown you, but there is low heat period in there. So for climate change, there it would be a blessing because you have now warmer environment to use the moisture and increase growth. In the north, theoretically, it could be a productive forest if warming was to coincide with the increase in precipitation. But northern Alberta, anyway, is dry, so warming probably exacerbate the drought problem in there. So for assisted migration in Alberta, then we have to deal with the managing forest productivity under drought in central and northern parts of the province. And what do we do that? We need to have populations that can tolerate drought. Now we have to start thinking in terms of drought as a limiting factor, not winter as a limiting factor when we go into the future. So we need the populations that can withstand the drought and therefore allows us to maintain productivity, forest productivity in the central part of the province and at high latitude in northern Alberta. And also increasing productivity in the mountain areas. Now the mountain areas will warm, use the moisture, but the population in there are those ones which are adapted to growing slowly. So if you want them to change, probably you need 1,000 years for them to change naturally. So then, from assisted migration point of view, then it's become an issue of moving population from the lower elevation part of the province, like in the central part of Alberta, moving those into the mountains as a way of putting the population that can use that moisture. That is a form of assisted migration. And we are now doing some additional experiments and studies in order to find a way of dealing with the drought-related issues. So I'll just quickly go through some ongoing work. So as a way of gathering the information for assisted migration, then allowing the provinces to create policies that manage reforestation in the future climate. One of such experiments that are going on now for almost 10 years, we are just retesting some of the population that we have in the environments that were originally considered not necessary to test in those areas. This is white spruce from across Western North America, and it has 18 sites, sponsored by BC. So most of the sites are located in BC, and 2 sites in Alberta and 1 in the Northwest Territories. So we have 90 population, wild population from Alberta and BC. The other project is an adaptive tree project. So it's basically a project that's being implemented by the U of A and UBC. It is using populations from Alberta, white spruce and large pine populations from Alberta. And it's basically a combination of greenhouse experiments with the drought stressing treatments. And then they're using, from those drought stressed trees, they're extracting DNA to try to understand the mechanism of drought tolerance and the mechanism of bird flushing and bird scent, and some other characteristics. The other projects that we're undertaking now is a tree species adaptation risk management project that is funded by the Climate Change Emission and Management Corporation of the CCMC. So this is the project that is being implemented by the Tree Improvement Alberta, which is the consortium of the ESRD and the Alberta forest companies that are involved in tree breeding programs. So it's basically including some component of field testing, largely meant to understand the mechanism and identify drought-tolerant species. We are now going to plant trees, white spruce, in experimental plots in Brooks. Brooks is dry. If you have ever drove in that part, it looks like a desert, especially in summer. So we are testing the plants in there to see if there are populations that can grow in the environment like that. You remember, according to Rick Schneider and some others, that same environment is what actually over time is going to move in central Alberta here in our green zone. So we need to see if there are actually populations that can live in that kind of environment and still giving you some measurable wood production to sustain the forest industry in Alberta. So there is an element of risk analysis in this project, like more or less in the same kind of approach of enterprise risk management approach. That's the industry does. We are analyzing the data by combining the data from the government experiments in research with that of forest companies' own data in order to try to get a provincial view of how the large pine and the white spruce adapt to the environment, and then use that one to develop some points. So that is a large program that is ongoing, and it's currently being hosted by the Foothill Research Institute, FRI. Now, based on the existing experiments that I've shown you, we have made some adjustment in the standards. Now, in addition to moving seed within the seed zone, you can get permission to use seed up to the maximum of 2 degrees north of latitude, from north to south, from south to north, not the other way around. Because you know, if you want more productivity, move from south to north and not the other way around. And 200 meters of elevation from lower to a higher, not the other way around. So these same standards basically would have been changed even if there was no climate change, because we continuously get new information from the trees, from experiments. The more we analyze experiments, the more we test trees in the field, we get some new insights in how the trees relate to the environment, and then we adjust the standard. British Columbia Ministry of Forestry has done the same thing. They have changed their standard to include the up from low to high elevation movement of seed and north and south to north, like we have done here. One additional thing that BC has done, I think BC has also done the assisted migration in the original sense of introducing a species outside the natural range. They have done it for one species. I haven't heard the Greenpeace complain because of the environmental movement in BC. I haven't heard complain about that. Maybe they don't know that BC has done that. So, but in Alberta, we are not doing that. So there's some additional information on the government website in here. I put a link in here. You can go and read some of the research material. So this is the end. I just want to thank the Alberta Tree Improvement and Seed Center, which has been managing these experiments for almost 40 years. And thank the college for inviting me and giving me a chance to learn. I hope you have given you sufficient information in the most simplified presentation or details, so at least you know what we do and why we do it. Thanks.
I have one question.
Yeah, sure.
So, like earlier this morning, we saw the progression of the geoclimatic zones, like how they're changing and moving north. And it looks like, you know, they were modeled on just 35 years in the future or 50 years in the future, and we've got completely different ecosystems.
Yeah.
Shouldn't we do a seed zone map based on what the ecotype's going to be in 100 years? If we like do a 100-year rotation, right now we're already way behind the 8 ball because the trees we're planting in our seed zones now won't be. They'll be in a completely different ecosite in 100 years when they're mature enough to harvest.
Yeah, sure. I think when you are planting trees, you are as an adaptation to climate change, you have to consider two things, and Rick touched a little bit about this. The tree you plant has to go through phases of development. It first has to grow to germinate in there, and in order to do that, in the area establishment cycle, it has to be able to tolerate the environment that is already there now. But your trees are going to be harvested 100 years from now. So in terms of productivity, the trees would look as if they are lagging behind time. When you think of production will rise in 100 years from now. Maybe you can say, if you wanted a productive forest 100 years from now, you would have planted a different population than you plant now. But you have to remember that winter is still in here. So at least during the first few decades of the life of that tree, it should be able to tolerate the current winter conditions. So then you have to balance those things. That's basically what we have. You have to make sure that, at least for now, given that we can manage the present, not necessarily manage the future that we don't know, we have to ensure survival and the regeneration success here. And that, for now, it is still managing the risk of regeneration failure through winter conditions. But yes, in the future, when we gain confidence that the climate is changing for sure, then we may have to adjust what we are planting now in anticipation of the future. Any other question?
Thank you very much, Dio. We're now going to draw for a few of the door prizes. If we can get this open. So when I call your name, you can just come up to the table over here and pick whatever you like. The one. The first person, Dan Barry.
Don't pick that one. Try and stir it a little bit.
Hudson Foley.